Robin Niblett. He is Distinguished Fellow and former Director at Chatham House. Dr. Niblett, welcome to the program. So Ukraine is hoping that this agreement will improve relations with the Trump administration. What is your assessment of this deal beyond developing the mineral resources, including oil and gas? What does this deal represent on the global stage?
Well, it's a fundamental deal because I think what the Ukrainians are trying to do is make sure not just the Trump administration, but in the long term, the United States has a direct stake in the survival of Ukraine as a sovereign state that has not been taken over or turned into a vassal state by Russia, which obviously was Vladimir Putin's objective 3 years ago when he launched his invasion, roughly now in 2022. If the Americans, especially if the Trump administration, the most America first of all presidents, a president who seems to believe in big powers having spheres of influence in their regions, if Trump can sign off on a deal that the Ukrainian government has to then protect, and where America has a stake in Ukraine's long-term sovereignty, that is a massive strategic gain. There'll be one other dimension to it, which has come up, at least in the discussions that President Macron of France had during his visit earlier this week in Washington, which is that Macron and the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer are trying to commit the capacity to put their troops on the ground to help provide reassurance for any future deal. So if they are able to get the Trump administration to support that idea, then not only would the US have a stake, an economic stake in the survival of Ukraine, but any Western troops there would be defending that stake. And that becomes extremely important. The US government would then want to help the European troops defend the stake. So you can see what I'm saying. This is much more than an economic deal. This really is a strategic step.
The UK Prime Minister putting his money where his mouth is on boosting the military budget. Do you think his plan to woo Mr. Trump with a defense spending surprise will pay off for Britain and the EU?
Well, I think it's a minimum step. Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced yesterday what for Britain is quite an extreme move to reduce its share of GDP in overseas development assistance from 0.5% to 0.3% over the next 2 years in order to increase defense spending from 2.3% to 2.5% of GDP in a fixed 2-year timeframe. So he's coming, Keir Starmer, to Washington tomorrow with a really tough commitment of extra £6 billion, roughly, let's say $8 billion or so a year in defense spending, as his kind of, I won't call it his gift, but let's call it his commitment to Trump. And it's not gone unnoticed that this is being done by reducing foreign aid spending, which, of course, the Trump administration has slashed.
Aside to his commitment to Mr. Trump, what is Britain ultimately pushing for here?
Well, I think what it's pushing for is a signal in Britain itself to say to the British people, we have entered a new phase of our international relations. It is the end of the post-Cold War order. We are in a new geopolitical standoff for the long term with Russia, certainly. And Europe cannot rely on the United States for its long-term security, at least in the conventional realm. America is turning towards Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, towards China as its principal focus. Europeans have to take more responsibility for their own security. Otherwise, the US will not be a partner for us. And ahead of a meeting that Keir Starmer is hoping to hold of other European leaders this Sunday, after he returns from Washington, he wants to be able to say to all of them, look, we're stepping forward. We're taking the lead. Europe's security is our responsibility. It is not America's anymore. And by making this step of the increase in defense spending, he's hoping to back President Macron and also send a signal to Chancellor Merz, the new, probably almost definitely Chancellor of Germany following the German elections over the weekend. They're trying to build up some momentum, if I can call it that, for Europe itself in this direction.
So what more does it take to make sure that America will not walk away. Do you foresee this European charm offensive being enough for now to keep President Trump on side?
Look, what's enough? President Trump is at the very minimum a tough negotiator. So what I would say is this is an important first step in that direction, but we haven't even touched yet on the trade issue. I mean, here we are dealing with the Ukraine peace. There is, in parallel to this, the risk that President Trump is going to be imposing significant tariffs at the minimum on European and maybe UK steel and aluminium, up to 25%. There is a whole potential slew of new tariffs where the EU in particular is in his sights. So I think Europeans are literally taking day by day. Leaders like Keir Starmer and Macron are trying not to get distracted by President Trump's more extreme statements about, Zelensky of Ukraine being a dictator, etc. They're trying to keep their eye. If we can get a deal on Ukraine and help President Trump deliver peace with Russia in Ukraine, maybe he'll then step back and not follow through on some of the more extreme trade threats that are being put out there. And that, of course, is incredibly important for the European economy. How are we going to pay in Europe for the increased defense if we go into a recession as a result of not being able to export as much as we do to America? So, these things are all interconnected. So I think this is why Macron in particular and Starmer are really focused on Ukraine now. Can they get a win with President Trump on Ukraine and then try to push off the risks of deterioration of the relationship on the trade front?
And of course, there's Russia. Within Mr. Trump's first month back in power, he's done quite a bit, overturning Washington's policy by, opening bilateral talks with Moscow without any European allies or Ukraine at the table. Where do you see this leading to in terms of U.S. and Russia's relations?
I take a slightly less, frantic approach than some of my European counterparts on this. President Trump is all about the deal, as we know, as he says himself. The deal with Russia over Ukraine is his near-term priority. To do that deal, he needs to treat, he knows, President Trump more as an equal, not have him in the doghouse, which is where President Biden had correctly, in my opinion, put President Trump, had correctly put President Putin. But the view of Trump here is I need to show some face to President Putin. I need to show to him that we're equals on the big stage. And he's thinking if I can treat President Putin that way, I might be able to convince him that there's a possibility of a bigger relationship over the next few years between the United States and Russia, in which maybe there might even be economic deals that could be done bilaterally. There might be on rare earth elements as well from Russia. It has many of them that maybe they can think of a longer term relationship economically between the two countries. Sanctions that the US has imposed might be lifted. Now, part of that is to get the deal done. Part of it, I think, for Trump as well, is to cause some uncertainty in the China-Russia relationship. President Trump knows that negotiating with China or negotiating with Russia, when the two of them are tightly connected because of the war in Ukraine, would be a lot easier if he could just split them a little bit. And doing a deal with Putin, treating him as an equal, injects some uncertainty potentially into the China-Russia relationship, where, of course, Russia, if it's alone, relies so much more on China. If he can do that, then America can turn to take a tougher line potentially towards China than it can do today. So I think actually Trump is being quite astute. If you're a European, obviously seeing this is worrying. But as a European, our focus needs to be on helping and ensuring Ukraine's survival as a sovereign state. And we may need to take a bit of abuse from Trump along the way in order to achieve that goal. So I think, in Beijing, they're going to be looking at this with some uncertainty. My final point on this would be, if I'm President Putin, of course, I'm not going to trust President Trump either. Can he deliver this deal over the long term? American foreign policy is now famously quite jarring and extreme. It flips from one side to another. Can President Putin trust the future president of America to uphold the deals that President Trump might deal? So it's very complicated, but I can see what Trump is trying to do here.
All right, Dr. Niblett, we appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Robin Niblett, their Distinguished Fellow and former Director at Chatham House.